Chapter 2 The Fire. Meg explained it one night at the fire. Dreams get caught in the webs woven in your bones. That's where they live, in the marrow there. He poked at the crackling wood with a pointy stick till the shadows were frenetic against his tanned face, till they slid into the longer shoots of his hair near the front of his mohawk. The tendrils he swept up and patted into place atop the shorter brush with the care of a pageant queen. He didn't make eye contact with us, the motley group seated in a loose semicircle around the fire beneath the trees where he commanded place. I imagined spider webs in my bones and turned my palms towards the moon, watching the ballet of bones between my elbow and my wrist twist to make it so. I saw the webs clotted with dreams like fat flies, and I wondered if the horses I'd ridden into the dawn were still caught in there like
Meg
bugs,
nudged the
woody
rounded
at the
stones
stones placed around the perimeter of the fire with his boot. You could see where the holes in his sole had been patched up with sap and scavenged leather. How did they get in there? Riri, now 7, was always curious and not shy with her questions. You're born with them. Your DNA weaves them into the marrow like spinners, Meg answered. The flames tried to settle and he prodded them to dance again. He added, that's where they plucked them from. I pulled each one of my fingers into my palm and made a fist silhouetted against the fire, flames licking around the tight ball of brown and bone. I imagined my brother tied to a chair at the school, a flock of gray-hooded villains tightening his bearded chains as they recited Hail Mary like synchronized swimmers. Meg sat, satisfied that we were all at attention, that we were listening with every cell. He leaned against the felled tree beside Minerva, who woke up with his rustling. He rolled a smoke out of his precious tobacco stores and plucked a twig from out of the fire with a burning ember at the tip to light it with. Old Minerva, nearsighted to squinting, lifted her nose at the smell. Her lips fell slack and she sighed, and those first few exhales were big and wasteful as Meg tried to get the damp paper to light, and smoke billowed across the clearing like messages. Everything was always damp, so we were trained to sniff out mold to keep the sickness at bay. Minerva made her hands into shallow cups and pulled the air over her head and face, making prayers out of ashes and smoke. Real old-timey, that Minerva. Meg and Minerva were the only grown-ups in our group. Meg wore his hair shaved to the skull except down the middle, and had a mustache that only grew on the left side of his top lip. He was tall but bent like a walking question mark, and he was short with words and patience. Meg wore army pants, alternating between 2 identical pairs, and layers of brown and green sweaters. He kept a small pouch hung on a shoelace around his neck and tucked into those sweaters, and once when I'd asked him, he told me that was where he kept his heart, because it was too dangerous to keep it in his chest, what with all the sharp edges of bone so easily broken. I never asked again. Too many metaphors and stories wrapped in stories. It could be exhausting talking to Meg. Minerva was dark, round, and tiny like a tree stump. She kept her long gray hair in 2 braids like a little girl, with a flowered kerchief tied over her head and under her round chin. She had old-timey ways, but you couldn't get much from her either. She didn't talk, and when she did, it was in bursts accompanied by laughter and maybe a scream or two. Mostly, she watched. Everything. Us kids playing in the river, the way the trees tilted to the north towards what was left of the natural landscape beyond the clear-cut strip of topsoil. She watched the birds on their perpetual migration to anywhere, the fire at the end of the day, and the way that we clapped each other's back when trading off on the trap lines. There were 7 of us in the group, 5 boys and 2 girls, not including the elders. Not one of us was related by blood, which was a good thing for those closer in age, since in the old days, when our families were huge and sprawling, accidentally dating a second or a third cousin meant that you had to ask about genealogy right off the bat. But it was also lonely, not having the common connection of grandparents or aunties like we used to have so often. There was Cheeboy, who at 17 was the oldest boy and taller than anyone else. He was quiet almost to the point of being mute, and skinny as a doe. He never seemed to sleep as long as the rest of us or need as much food, and he stuck close to Mig, so that whenever he was needed, he was no more than 1 syllable away. He came from the west, from the Cree lands. After Cheeboy, there was me, 16. I was nicknamed Frenchie as much as for a name as for my people, the Métis. I came from a long line of hunters, trappers, and voyageurs, but now, with most of the rivers cut into pieces and lakes left as gray sludge puckers on the landscape, my own history seemed like a myth along the lines of dragons. Compared to Cheeboy's 6+ feet, I wasn't the tallest, but I did have the longest hair of any of the boys, almost to my waist, burnt ombre at the untrimmed edges. I braided it myself each morning to keep it out of the way and to remind myself of things I couldn't quite remember, but nevertheless I knew to be true. My clothes were also burnt from the sun and wear, a mottled brown from the original tones of black. Then there were the 12-year-old twins, Cherie and Ziguan, whose matched green eyes communicated without words between them. They were broader than the rest of us, their wide shoulders and heavy hands that hung from ropey arms. They were dotted with scars I couldn't bring myself to ask about. They shared one baseball cap between the two of them, changing it from head to head, one day to the next. Slopper was next, the 9-year-old with the belly of a 50-year-old diabetic. His family came from the East Coast. The girls had Wob, who at 18 was practically a woman. She had a vicious keloid slash that split her face nearly in two. Then there was Riri, who came from a Métis community close to where my fathers had said ours used to be, who was old enough to piss in the bush and swear when we played red ass on abandoned brick walls, but who was still a child. As kids, we longed for the old-timey. We wore our hairs in braids to show it. We made sweat lodges out of broken branches, dug into the earth, covered over with our shirts tied together at the buttonholes. Those lodges weren't very hot, but we sat in them for hours and willed the sweat to pop out over our willowy arms and hairless cheeks. It's time for story. Mig exhaled smoke as he spoke. I watched the word story puff over the fire and spread into a cumulative haze that smelled of ground roots and acrid burns just above our dark heads. Slopper struggled to his feet and started over to his tent. The youngest weren't privy to story, not yet anyway. Riri made the face she pulled out when she wanted something, like an extra piece of camp bread or to sleep in my tent so that I could tell her stories to keep the nightmares away. Mig just looked at her, lifting one eyebrow higher than the other. "Oh, Mig, can't I stay for a little bit?" She received no answer, and kicked rocks all the way back to her tent. The woods grew quiet now. Even the beetles stopped rubbing their smooth shells on softened bark. Even the wind picked up around the branches instead of rattling straight through. Mig leaned in so that the fire illuminated his face from the bottom like unsteady stage lights, and he opened his hand, palm down, to indicate the ground. This ground, as he began story.